snow is falling sideways over the harbor, and the old man on the dock cannot hear the three men shouting at him to leave. He stands at the head of the gangway in a canvas coat gone gray with salt, one hand flat against a wooden post worn smooth by 60 winters of the same hand. His mouth is set. His eyes move from face to face, reading what the wind carries away from him, and he does not step back. Behind him, the gray water heaves against the pilings. In front of him, a man in a clean, dark overcoat holds up a folded paper and taps it the way people tap a paper at someone they have already decided does not count. P. A truck idles at the foot of the pier, with its hazards blinking amber into the falling snow. The man with the paper says something, and the other two laugh, and one of them turns to the small crowd gathering at the harbor rail and says the words loud enough for everyone to hear. Do not bother. He cannot hear you anymore. Save your breath. That was when the Marine came down the hill with the dog. Most of the people at the rail had not noticed him at all until the dog moved. The German shepherd had been sitting at his left knee, calm, ears up, and then the dog rose without a sound and leaned forward toward the dock, and the man followed where the dog was looking. He took in the old man, the paper, the truck, the laughter. He did not hurry. He came down the icy ramp with the careful rolling weight of a man who had learned to move on bad ground, and he did not stop at the rail with the others. He went past them. He went all the way down to the dock, and the laughter thinned out, and he knelt down in the snow in front of the old man, so that their eyes were level, and he began to speak with his hands. If this story stays with you, stay with it to the end. There is more here than a paper in a cold morning. His name was Becket Ames, and he had come to this town the way a man comes to a place when he has run out of better ideas. 39 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a short crop of dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that did not give much away. He had been a gunnery sergeant. He had been a great many things since. For the last 2 years, he had been a man with a dog and a truck and a duffel, fixing boat engines up and down the coast for cash, taking the work nobody local wanted, leaving before anybody learned his last name. The blast that ended his service had not taken his legs or his hands. It had taken most of the hearing in his left ear and a good portion of the right, the high notes first, and the soft ones, then whole rooms of sound he used to take for granted. He could hear a diesel engine knock. He could hear the dog bark close. He could not hear a woman say his name across a kitchen or a kettle starting to whistle, or the difference between rain and applause. The doctors had given him a word for it and a pair of aids that howled in the wind, and he had taught himself, slowly and with no small amount of anger, to read the shape of words off a moving mouth. He had learned to sign in a hospital ward from a chaplain who had a deaf brother. He had never expected to need any of it again. The dog's name was Coda. A working-line German shepherd, large and square and muscular, with a tan-and-black saddle coat and a black mask over his muzzle and ears that stood up straight as church spires. Coda had been trained by another man in another life, and had come to Becket the way the rest of it had, second-hand and grieving. The dog did not bark at strangers. The dog watched them. Becket had learned that Coda's stillness said more than most men's shouting, and he trusted the dog's read on a person more than he trusted his own. They had rolled into Mercy Cove 2 days before the snow, looking for nothing but a few weeks of engine work and a cheap room. Mercy Cove was a working harbor at the cold end of a Maine peninsula, a town of weathered shingle houses stacked up a granite hill above a horseshoe of gray water, a chandlery, a bait shop, a church with a leaning steeple, and a fish pier that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place that did not so much welcome a stranger as wait to see whether he would leave on his own. He had found the room above the chandlery, and he had found the old man on the very first afternoon, and he had not yet learned that the two facts were about to braid themselves into the same rope. The old man was Silas Marsh, 78 years old, lean and upright despite his age, with a full head of white hair that the wind never managed to flatten, and a pair of pale eyes that fixed on a person's mouth the instant they began to speak. He had been the harbor pilot at Mercy Cove for 51 years, the man who brought the lobster boats and the occasional barge through the ledges at the mouth of the cove in fog so thick you could lose your own hand. He had lost his hearing a piece at a time across his 60s, a family thing, his mother before him and her father before her. By 70 he had gone entirely silent inside, and by then it had not mattered to him much, because he knew the harbor by the feel of it, through the soles of his boots and the slant of the boat under his hand. The bottom of that cove was written in him deeper than sound. Beckett met him because Coda walked them down to the water on that first afternoon nose-working and stopped at the foot of a boathouse at the far end of the pier. The boathouse was old, silver-shingled, with a single light, burning yellow, inside against the gray. Through the open door, Beckett had seen the old man bent over the gutted block of a diesel engine, a handlight gripped in his teeth, working a wrench by feel, and Beckett had stood in the doorway a long moment before he understood what he was watching. The old man did not look up at footsteps. He had no reason to. Beckett stepped into the light so his shadow fell across the engine, and the old man turned, unsurprised, and looked at him. What happened next decided everything that came after, though neither of them knew it. Beckett lifted his hands and signed, slow and a little rusty. "Are you the man who fixes engines?" It opened like a shutter coming off a window in spring. He had not had a single soul speak to him in his own language in 11 years. That answer Silas gave him stayed in Beckett's head longer than he expected. The old man signed back fast and joyful and overflowing, and Beckett had to lift a hand and slow him down, laughing in spite of himself, and admit that he was out of practice. They worked it out between signs and a grease pencil and a piece of cardboard. By dark, Beckett had a part-time job and the first conversation he had truly had in 2 years. And Silas Marsh had something he had stopped believing he would ever have again, which was a man who would simply talk to him. For some reason, Beckett could not find the loneliness he usually carried anywhere inside himself that night. He noticed its absence the way you notice a toothache stopping. He learned the town through the old man's hands across the next 2 days. Silas owned the boathouse outright, and the strip of waterfront it sat on, deeded to his family before Maine was even a state worth deeding, a narrow parcel that did not look like much, and was, Beckett would come to understand, worth more than every house on the hill combined. The harbor was changing. A development company out of Portland had been buying the waterfront a parcel at a time. The bait shop, the old cannery lot, the failed marina, assembling something the town did not yet have a name for. Silas's strip sat in the middle of it like a missing tooth. One piece the company could not seem to buy because the deaf old man who owned it would not sell and could not be talked into it, and did not answer letters he could not be bothered to read. Beckett did not think much about any of that on the second night. He thought about it a great deal on the third morning, when he came down the hill with the dog, and saw the truck idling at the foot of the pier and the man in the clean overcoat tapping his folded paper, and heard one of them tell the gathering crowd not to bother, that the old man could not hear them any more. Years of war had trained Beckett to read a threat in the space of a breath, but years of silence had trained him to read something else, The particular cruelty of people who raise their voices at a man precisely because they know he cannot hear them. It is a thing the hearing do without thinking. It is a thing the deaf feel like a slap. He felt it now on the old man's behalf, hot and immediate, and he went down the ramp and past the rail and knelt in the snow in front of Silas Marsh and began to sign. "What is happening?" he asked. Silas's hands were shaking, and not from the cold. "They say I cannot stay," he signed. "They have a paper that says I cannot take care of myself. They say I cannot understand. The man says he is my guardian now. He says, I do not get to decide." Beckett took the folded paper out of the overcoat man's hand before the man fully understood what was happening, and the man let him, because the man assumed the Marine was there to translate the bad news and move things along. The paper was a notice of a temporary guardianship order granted by a probate court 2 counties south, naming one Gideon Thorne of Cordwell Conservatorship Group as the temporary guardian of the person and estate of Silas Marsh, an adult found by preliminary evaluation to be incapacitated and unable to communicate his wishes or manage his affairs. Unable to make himself understood, Beckett read that line twice. Then he looked up at the man in the overcoat, who was smiling the patient, rehearsed smile of a man who had done this many times, and he stood up out of the snow to his full height, and the smile changed by a small degree. Gideon Thorne was 48, smooth-faced and trim, with combed dark hair going clean at the temples, and the kind of expensive gray overcoat that does not wrinkle, no matter what it is asked to do. He held a leather folder against his chest like a shield. He had 2 men with him, large and bored, the sort who lift and load and do not ask questions. He spoke slowly to Beckett, in the loud, careful voice people use on the slow. "This is a legal matter," he said. "County has appointed me. This man is not competent to remain here alone. We have a placement arranged for him, a very good facility. It is for his own safety. I understand you mean well, but you are interfering with a court order." Beckett did not answer right away. He had learned in 2 years of quiet that a silence held a beat too long does more work than any sentence. Coda had come to stand at his left knee, ears forward, leaning into that particular forward stance the dog took when he had decided about a person. Beckett let the silence sit until Thorne's careful smile began to tighten at the corners. Then he said quietly, "He understands me fine." Thorne's eyes flicked to the old man, then back. "I'm sure you've had some friendly gestures," he said. "That is not the same as legal competence. The evaluation is complete. The order is signed. He'll be moved this afternoon." Beckett turned away from him without another word, knelt back down in the snow, and signed to Silas, slow and clear. "Where is the deed to your land?" The old man's hands answered before his mind caught up to the question, and Beckett read the answer, and something settled in his chest that had not settled in a long time. He stood, and he looked at Thorne, and he said, "You are not moving him today." And then he walked Silas up the ramp through the parting crowd with the dog at their heels, and the truck idled, and the snow came down, and Gideon Thorne watched them go with an expression that was no longer smiling at all. The pressure in Beckett's chest tightened as they climbed the hill because he knew what he had just done. He had made himself the thing standing between a patient, well-funded machine and the parcel it wanted, and he had done it on a morning when he was supposed to be packing a truck and leaving town. He looked down at the old man laboring up the icy hill beside him, white hair wild in the wind, and he found that he did not want to leave town at all. That hit him harder than he expected. The woman who ran the chandlery was named Nora Tate, 66, broad and capable, with iron-gray hair in a braid and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and a way of looking at a man that took inventory of him in about 4 seconds. She had rented Beckett the room above her store without asking his last name, which he had appreciated. When he brought Silas through her door out of the snow with the dog and the folded court paper, she took one look at the three of them and put the kettle on without being asked. She knew the whole shape of it before Beckett finished. She had watched Cordwell Conservatorship Group work the coast for 2 years. The pattern was always the same. They found an old person who was alone, or stubborn, or sitting on land. Somebody wanted, and they found a way to have that person declared incapable of running their own life. A guardian was appointed, paid out of the very estate they were seizing. The old person was placed in a facility a comfortable distance away, where visitors were inconvenient and complaints went into a drawer. And the property, freed of its difficult owner, was sold to settle the costs of the guardianship, often to a buyer who had been waiting in the wings the whole time. It was legal, it was clean. It wore a good overcoat and carried paperwork, and it almost never lost because the people it targeted could not fight it and had no one who would. Silas had something most of them did not, Nora said, watching the old man's hands as Beckett translated. Silas had a strip of waterfront that the development company had been trying to buy for 3 years, and Silas had refused them every time. So they had found another way in. If they could not buy the land from a competent man, they would have the man declared incompetent and buy it from his guardian instead. The deafness was the door. A man who does not answer letters, who does not speak on the phone, who cannot be examined the way a hearing man is examined, is an easy man to call confused. They had not declared him incapable because he was. They had declared him incapable because it was convenient, and because they had bet that no one would ever bother to ask the old deaf man what he actually thought. They had bet wrong. Beckett signed to Silas, and the old man read it off his hands and held very still, and his pale eyes filled, and he did not let it fall. That night, Silas slept in the back room of the chandlery on a cot, with Coda stretched across the doorway like a sentry, and Beckett sat awake by the wood stove and worked the problem the way he had once worked a map before patrol. He had a court order he had to overturn, he had an evaluation he had to break, he had a guardian he had to expose, and he had until that order became permanent, at a hearing scheduled, the paper said, for 18 days out. He wrote the number on the back of his hand and looked at it for a long time. The first thing he did in the gray of the next morning was the simplest thing, and the thing no one in the entire process had done. He sat Silas down at Nora's table with a camera Nora kept for insurance photos, and he asked the old man, in his own language, to tell him everything: who he was, where he was born, what year it was, who the president was, what the boathouse meant, what he wanted. He asked him the same questions he was certain that the agency's evaluator had been required to ask, and he filmed Silas Marsh answering every one of them in fluent, fluid, unmistakable language, sharp as a man half his age, naming dates and tides and the depth of water over the eastern ledge at half flood. He filmed the old man's hands, saying plainly, "I am not confused. I do not wish to leave. No one asked me. They only spoke at me and wrote down that I said nothing." He learned, filming, what the evaluation had actually been. Silas told it with a kind of weary contempt. A man had come to the boathouse 3 weeks before. A man Beckett would later learn was Thorne's own contracted assessor, paid by Cordwell, not by any court. The man had stood in the doorway and spoken at Silas, loudly facing away, and when Silas had pointed at his own ears and shaken his head, and reached for the cardboard and the grease pencil he kept for the rare hearing visitor, the man had simply written something on a clipboard and left. Subject unresponsive to questions, the report would say, subject unable to communicate, disoriented, exhibits confusion. The whole finding of incapacity rested on a man refusing to write down a single word for a deaf man who was holding out a pencil. Beckett's hands were steady when he filmed it, but the old anger was awake in him now, the protective kind he had spent 2 years keeping under discipline. He did not let it into his face because Silas read faces, and the old man had carried enough. Outside, snow kept falling over Mercy Cove. Inside, something was changing, person by person, as the town began to learn what was being done to one of its own. Nora made the calls Beckett could not make because the phone was no good to him. She called the probate court and learned the hearing date was real and the temporary order was real, and that Silas, having been declared incapable of speaking for himself, had not been appointed any independent voice of his own, which meant the only person legally speaking for him was the guardian who profited from silencing him. She called the facility named on the placement form and learned it was 90 miles inland, a locked memory unit, no water in sight. She called a lawyer she knew in Rockland, a tired woman named Adele, who took 2 cases a year for nothing because her own father had died in a place like the one on the form, and Adele said the words that gave Beckett his map. "You do not win this by arguing he is competent," she said. "They will say you are a stranger and a soft touch. You win it by proving the evaluation was fraud, and by giving the court no choice but to hear the man himself." So that became the plan. Prove the fraud, put Silas Marsh in front of the court, and make them watch him speak. Gideon Thorne had not built a business on losing, and he had foreseen, the way competent predators do, exactly the move that an inconvenient defender would make. Beckett discovered this 2 days later when he and Silas walked down to the boathouse to retrieve the original deed, the one document that proved beyond argument that Silas owned the land free and clear, the deed Beckett intended to put in Adele's hands. The boathouse door had a new hasp on it, and a heavy padlock, and a notice taped to the silver shingles declaring the structure secured as property of the estate under the management of the guardian, entry prohibited. Thorne had locked the old man out of his own life's work, and inside, where the deed had always been kept in a tin box in the engine bench, the deed now sat behind a door. Only the guardian could legally open. Silas stood in front of his own locked boathouse with the snow gathering on his white hair, and for the first time he looked old. Beckett watched the fight go out of the old man's shoulders, and he understood that this was the real attack, not the truck, not the loud men. This, the slow theft of a man standing in his own life, the message that even his tools and his bench and his 60 years of work now belonged to someone else's paper. Coda pressed his shoulder against the old man's leg and leaned, and Silas put a shaking hand down into the dog's fur and held on. Beckett did not break the lock. He wanted to. He stood there a long moment, wanting to put his boot through the door, and he did not, because a stranger who breaks a lock hands the other side the only story they need. Instead, he took a photograph of the padlock and the notice, and he signed to Silas, "We will open it the right way." And they walked back up the hill, and that night Beckett sat by the stove and admitted to himself that he had no idea where else the deed might be, and that without it, the whole plan was a film of an old man's hands against a stack of stamped documents. And stamped documents win. The black part of it came on the 9th day. Word had spread, as it does in a small town, And Thorne came up the hill to the chandlery himself, alone this time, smooth and reasonable, to make the offer he had clearly decided would end the matter cleanly. He laid a check on Nora's counter, made out to Silas Marsh for a sum with a great many zeros, more money than the old man had seen in his life. The guardianship could be resolved by agreement, Thorne explained in his slow, loud voice, watching Beckett translate. Mr. K. Marsh signs a voluntary placement and a sale. The court closes the case. Everyone is spared the unpleasantness of a hearing, and Mr. Marsh lives out his years comfortable and cared for. It was generous. It was, Thorne said, more than fair. Beckett translated all of it, every word, faithfully, because Silas had the right to hear his own choices. And he watched the old man look at the check and look at the money. And he saw the exhaustion in the old man's face, the 78 years of it, the temptation not to fight. For a moment Beckett was sure he had lost. Then Silas Marsh pushed the check back across the counter with one finger and lifted his hands and signed something, slowly looking straight at Thorne so the man could not pretend he had said nothing. Beckett spoke it aloud for him in his own flat, quiet voice. He says the harbor is not for sale. He says, you can hear me now. He says, tell the court I said that. Thorne picked up his check and folded it back into his leather folder, and the patient smile was gone, and what was underneath it was the thing that had been underneath it all along, cold and unhurried. He looked at Beckett and said very softly, so the others would not catch it, you are a drifter with a dog. In 18 days you will be gone, and he will be in the facility, and the parcel will be sold, and not one piece of paper anywhere will have your name on it. He said it like a man stating the weather. Then he left, and the bell over the door rang behind him, and Beckett stood in the cold draft of it and knew the man was probably right. He almost left. That is the part he never told anyone afterward. That night he packed a duffel and he sat with his hand on the truck keys, because Thorne had named the exact shape of his life out loud, the drifter who does not stay, the man whose name is on nothing. And there is no wound like being read correctly by a man you despise. Coda sat in front of the door and would not move. Beckett looked at the dog a long time. He thought about a chaplain in a hospital ward who had taught a furious deaf Marine to sign because no one else had bothered, and how that one man's bothering had reached him across the worst year of his life. He thought about the old man asleep in the back room who had not been spoken to in his own language in 11 years until 2 days ago. He put the keys down. The next morning he stopped trying to find the deed and started trying to break the man instead. He went back to the assessor's report, the one Nora had pried loose from the court file. He read the name of the assessor at the bottom, and he had Nora, tracked the man down, and what they learned changed the whole shape of the fight. The assessor was not a doctor. He was a contractor who did intake evaluations for Cordwell on a per-head fee, paid more when he found incapacity than when he did not, a fact that was buried in the agency's own billing structure. He had filed 11 such reports along the coast in 2 years, and every single one had found the subject incapacitated, and every single one of those 11 people was now in a facility while their property moved through the estate. 11 for 11. No honest evaluator finds incapacity 11 times out of 11. The number itself was the evidence. A man is not unlucky 11 times. A man is paid. Beckett brought that to Adele in Rockland, and Adele's tired eyes sharpened, and she said, now we have something. A pattern of findings, a financial incentive, and a video of the subject communicating fluently. She filed a motion to vacate the temporary order and to remove the guardian for cause, and she demanded the assessor appear at the hearing. and she requested that the court provide a certified sign interpreter so that Silas Marsh could address the court directly. With a request the court could not refuse without admitting it had declared a man unable to communicate without ever once offering him a way to communicate. That left the deed, and the deed was still behind the guardian's padlock, and the boathouse was still posted as estate property. The boathouse gave it up in the end, and it gave it up because of the dog. On the 14th day, Silas asked to walk down to the water. He could not go inside, but he wanted to stand near the boathouse, the way a man stands near a thing that has been taken from him. Beckett went with him, and Coda ranged ahead the way he did. Nose down along the snow line at the base of the building, and at the seaward corner, the dog stopped and would not come when called. He stood with his nose pressed to a gap under the lowest shingle course where the building met the granite, and he held, the way a trained dog holds on a thing he has been told matters, and he looked back at Beckett and held again. Beckett crouched at the corner. There was a space there, where the old boathouse did not quite meet the ledge, a dry shelf of stone under the sill that a man would only know about if he had built his whole life around that building. He looked up at Silas, and he signed, "Is there something here?" And the old man's face changed, and he laughed, a real laugh, silent and shaking, and his hands flew. The tin box. He had moved it years ago. He did not keep the deed in the bench where any fool could find it. He kept it where the harbor kept its own secrets, in the dry under the sill, wrapped in oilcloth, because Silas Marsh was a careful man who had been careful his whole long life. And the men in the overcoats had locked an empty bench. Beckett reached into the dark, dry space under the sill, and his fingers closed on oilcloth, and he drew out a flat tin box gone soft with rust at the corners. And inside it, dry as the day it was folded, was the deed to the land in Silas Marsh's name, free and clear, recorded before any of them were born. He had not broken a lock. He had not entered the posted building. He had reached into the open ground beneath it, where the law had no padlock, and taken what had always been the old man's. Coda sat back on his haunches in the snow, satisfied, the way he always was when the humans finally caught up to what he had known first. That answer the dog gave them stayed with Beckett a long time afterward. The plain fact that the dog had found in an afternoon what the overcoats had locked a door against for 2 weeks. The hearing was held on the 18th day in a low brick probate building 2 counties south, in a room with bad fluorescent light and rows of wooden chairs. Mercy Cove came with them. That was the thing Beckett had not counted on. Nora had spread the word, and the word had done its work, and when Beckett drove Silas down that gray morning, a line of trucks and old sedans followed them the whole 90 miles. The bait shop man, the woman from the church, Lobsterman Silas had guided through the ledges for, filling the back of that bleak little room until the referee asked who all these people were, and Nora stood up and said his neighbors. Gideon Thorne sat at the front table in his good overcoat with his leather folder and his contracted assessor beside him, and he did not look worried, because men like Thorne are not worried by neighbors. He was worried by the certified interpreter standing ready beside the witness chair, a woman the court had been obliged to provide, and he was worried Beckett saw the moment Adele entered the 11 prior findings into the record and asked the assessor to explain, under oath, how a man finds incapacity 11 times in 11 evaluations. The assessor's voice climbed as he answered. He talked about methodology and standards and the difficulty of evaluating the elderly. Adele let him talk the way you let a man dig, and then she asked him one question. She asked him whether, in the case of Silas Marsh, he had provided the subject any means to answer in writing or in sign, given that the subject was deaf, before recording that the subject could not respond. The room went quiet. The assessor looked at his hands. He said he did not recall. Adele played the 30 seconds of the film. Silas at Nora's table, hands moving clear and fluent and sharp, naming the date and the year and the depth of water over the eastern ledge at half flood. And the assessor watched a man he had certified as unable to communicate. And that was the moment the case died. Then the referee did the thing the whole machine had been built to prevent. She asked Silas Marsh, directly, through the interpreter, whether he understood where he was and what was being decided. And Silas rose, 78 years old, white hair combed flat for the occasion, and he answered the court in his own language, and the interpreter gave the court his words. He said he had piloted the boats of that harbor for 51 years and never put one on the ledges. He said he knew exactly where he was and exactly what these men wanted, which was his land and not his welfare. He said no one in the whole long process had asked him a single question until a stranger knelt down in the snow and used his hands. He said, and the interpreter's voice did not quite stay level saying it, that a man who cannot hear is not a man who cannot think, and that he would like, if the court did not mind, to go home now. The referee vacated the temporary order from the bench. She removed Gideon Thorne as guardian for cause and referred the 11 prior findings and the per-head fee structure to the state for investigation into every guardianship Cordwell had touched on that coast. She entered the deed, the dry deed, from under the sill into the record as proof of clear title, and she restored to Silas Marsh the full management of his person and his estate, which was a long formal way of saying the harbor was his again. Thorne was gone before the room had finished emptying. He did not argue, did not approach Silas, did not so much as close his folder slowly. He simply rose and walked out a side door into the gray, the way that kind of evil always walks out. Because it is never one man, it is a structure, and the structure had other coasts, and other old people, and other padlocks. And the most a single town can do is shut its own door and lock the thing out of one harbor. Cordwell would be investigated. The 11 would be looked into. Thorne himself slid into the snow and was not seen in Mercy Cove again. And Beckett understood, watching him go, that you do not defeat a thing like that so much as you make it leave. This once, this place, these people. They drove home in the early dark with the whole line of trucks behind them, and Silas Marsh sat in the passenger seat with a tin box in his lap and his hand resting on the dog between the seats, and he did not sign anything for a long time. Near the top of the hill, with the lights of Mercy Cove coming on below them, and the harbor a sheet of pewter beyond, he reached over and touched Beckett's arm to make him look, and he signed one word, "Stay," just the one. And then, because he was a careful man who had been careful his whole life, he added, "The engines need you," as if a man needs a reason to be asked to stay. Beckett did not answer right away. He had been a man who left for so long that the staying felt like stepping off a known ledge into water he could not read. He looked at the old man and the dog, and the lights of the town that had followed them 90 miles, and he found that the answer was already made, and had been made the night he put the truck keys down. He signed back, "The engines need me," which was the only way either of them knew how to say the larger thing. He stayed. The boathouse opened in the spring, the real spring, when the ice let go of the cove and the light came back long and gold off the water. The estate's padlock came off the hasp and went into the harbor, where Silas said all bad iron belonged. Beckett took the room above the chandlery for the year and then for longer, and the engine work came steady, the lobster boats lining up at the silver-shingled door, and on the cardboard by the bench, where Silas had once kept a grease pencil for the rare visitor who would write. There was now a whole second voice in the room. Two pairs of hands going at once over the gutted blocks, arguing about timing and tide, a deaf old man and a half-deaf younger one, who had finally found in the quietest town on a cold coast a place where his silence was not a wall, but a shared language. If this story stayed with you, then carry the part of it that matters, which is not the paper or the padlock or the man in the good overcoat. It is this. There are people all around you that the world has decided not to bother with. The ones who are slow now or quiet now or who cannot hear you call their names. And the world will tell you to save your breath that they cannot understand you anymore. Do not believe it. Kneel down, get level with them. Find the language they still have, and use it. Because the kindest thing one soul can do for another is simply to refuse to give up on the conversation. A man who cannot hear is not a man who cannot think. A man the world has written off is still a man, whole and waiting, and very often the only thing he needs is for one person to bother. May God keep you in the ones you love. May he set a faithful presence at your door and a patient friend at your side, and may you be, for someone the world has stopped listening to, the one who kneels down in the snow and speaks anyway. And when your own time comes to be quiet, may someone do the same for you. On the porch of the boathouse, in the last light, an old man sat with his hand on a sleeping dog's flank, and the harbor he had never once put a boat wrong in lay still and silver below him, and he was home.